Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Today's webinar is being recorded and the recording will be posted publicly. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I'd now like to turn the call over to your host, Bryce Hannibal.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the FSRDC Presentation Series. Today we have Dr. Melanie Woskog to present her research. A couple of announcements before we get started. First off, as I know you've heard me say before, if you have any interest in presenting at the presentation series, please feel free to reach out. We are going to be taking a little bit of a break. Our next webinar, our next presentation will be towards the end of the calendar year, and that's because we have the RDC Research Conference at the end of September. If you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me or to your local RDC administrator. We are going to have questions at the end, and Melanie has agreed that if we can't address your question, you are free to email her. Her contact information is in the flyer. When you type your question into the chat, make sure you select all panelists, and we will be sure to address that. One other thing that's fairly new, this is the first time we're presenting it, is that we have a new "What is an FSRDC" video. So if you head over to YouTube and you can type in FSRDC or what is an FSRDC, you'll see a video that came out about 2 weeks ago. It's a little under 3 minutes. It's very well done, does a very good job at capturing what we do, why RDC research is important, and it doesn't get too far into the weeds. So please share that as you see fit. Okay, so we are pleased to hear from Melanie Woskog today. She is an assistant professor of finance at Duke University, and her research spans the area of labor economics, entrepreneurship, and corporate finance. Her talk is titled "Entrepreneurial Spillovers Across Coworkers." So Melanie, I turn it over to you.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much, Bryce and Lisa and Census for having me. As Bryce said, I'm going to be presenting my job market paper from last year, Entrepreneurial Spillovers Across Coworkers. I'm going to basically give a short version of my job talk, but I'll try to sprinkle in throughout and then as well at the end some of my kind of thoughts about using the RDC data and everything like that. I have been using this data for, I guess it's 5 or 6 years at this point. I obviously used it for my job market paper. And so if anyone has questions on that particularly, I'm happy to answer them. With that, let's get started. As always, this data is using US Census Bureau data. And so everything you'll see today has been approved for disclosure. What that means is that we can legally talk about it outside of legal census domains. So to kick things off, I'd like to kind of think about a really prominent policy question, which is how can we promote more entrepreneurship, particularly more productive entrepreneurship? So this is a policy question that policymakers spend a lot of time and money thinking about because we know that entrepreneurship really contributes to a lot of growth and a lot of kind of increasing wealth in the economy. But to answer a policy question like this, we need to understand how entrepreneurship happens organically. So what makes someone wake up one day and decide to start their own firm? I'm going to be thinking about, in this paper, one possible source of new firms, entrepreneurial spillovers. So there's a variety of papers out there already thinking about kind of spillovers across a variety of relationships. Generally, we're thinking about, someone goes out and starts their own firm. And because they have that experience, they may affect someone else's decision to, down the road, start their own firm. Now, we have these papers, but we actually have mixed evidence in the literature so far on what is transmitted in these types of spillovers. And what is transmitted is going to matter a lot for the implications of the spillover. So, namely, if we have people basically being inspired by someone they know who ran their own firm, we may get more small businesses entering, more passion projects, things like that, that don't necessarily, intend to be the next large firm. On the other hand, if we have spillovers of skills and knowledge and so forth, maybe we have some productivity gains. And so what I'll be doing in this paper is thinking about these different mechanisms and their implications in the very broad context of spillovers across workplace coworkers in the US using the census data. So specifically, I'm going to be doing 2 broad things in this paper. The first is what I'm going to talk about today is reduced form, thinking about what do individuals learn from their entrepreneurial coworkers. So I'll talk a little bit in a bit about how we define entrepreneurship using this data, but we're going to think about if you happen to work, let's say, in a manufacturing plant, and one day you get a coworker who previously ran a construction firm, does that impact your likelihood of becoming an entrepreneur in the future, starting your own business in the future? And does that affect the type of firm you start? To answer this question, I think it's helpful to very quickly, go through, well, what could entrepreneurial coworkers be doing? On the one hand, they actually could be discouraging entrepreneurship. The vast majority of firms in the US, they don't survive very long. They seem like they fail. And so your coworkers who went through that experience, well, now they're your coworkers, so most often their business is no longer around. They might be describing how hard it is to become an entrepreneur, how difficult it is to succeed, and so forth. So that could discourage your likelihood of becoming an entrepreneur. On the other hand, they could actually promote entrepreneurship, and they could do so in kind of two broad ways. The first is promoting entrepreneurship, but without making you more profitable or more productive as an entrepreneur. So maybe your coworker is saying, it was amazing being my own boss, it was fun setting my own hours, all those sorts of things. They could be explaining startup logistics, things like that. That I'm going to, in this paper called Teaching Institutional Knowledge, that effectively lower the entry cost to entrepreneurship, but don't make you an amazing entrepreneur. The other option is that these coworkers could be promoting entrepreneurship and actually making you more productive. Maybe they're improving your business plans, teaching you skills, things like that, in ways that actually make you more likely to succeed as a business owner. I call these things entrepreneurial skills in the paper. So the name of the game to, this part of the paper is to really discern which of these are actually relevant out there, for whom are they relevant, and so forth. And to do that, I'm going to leverage variation in two things effectively. The first is just exposure to more entrepreneurial coworkers. So if you happen to have more entrepreneurial coworkers, are you more or less likely to become an entrepreneur? If you're less likely, maybe we're in case A. If you're more likely, maybe we're in case B and or C. Secondly, we're going to leverage variation in exposure to more what I'll call successful entrepreneurial coworkers. So conditional on the fact that you have so many entrepreneurial coworkers, were those entrepreneurial coworkers actually starting long surviving firms, large firms, productive firms? And we'll think that maybe those particular types of coworkers who seem like they had relatively good experiences, maybe they will actually transmit some skills. So this will be kind of an attempt to think about, is there kind of room for C happening? Is there room for productivity spillovers versus are we mostly in case B? Briefly on identification, we'll spend a bit of time on this in a bit, but obviously people are not randomly assigned coworkers. So I'm going to show you that the spillovers that I'll document are not going to be driven by some of the kind of common concerns we could have for identification, namely selection and common shocks. But I'll give quite a bit more on that in a bit. Now, the main findings will be that entrepreneurial coworkers do seem to, on average, promote entrepreneurship. If you work with more entrepreneurial coworkers, you yourself in the future are more likely to start a firm. The second thing is that conditional on being more likely to become an entrepreneur in the future, it seems like these entrepreneurial coworkers actually increase your profitability if they themselves started relatively successful firms. So how this pans out is that if you work with more entrepreneurial coworkers in general, frankly, they tend to be relatively unsuccessful entrepreneurs. And so you become an entrepreneur, but you're not a particularly good one either. And so this is going to be consistent with those average entrepreneurial coworkers teaching you institutional knowledge. They lower the entry cost, they get your foot in the door, but they're not teaching you skills that they frankly don't seem to have. However, conditional on that general exposure, if you are lucky enough to work with relatively successful entrepreneurial coworkers, you're more likely to become an entrepreneur, and it looks like you're more likely to become a successful entrepreneur. So this is going to be consistent with those successful entrepreneurial coworkers actually maybe teaching you some skills. And so there's some scope for productivity spillovers here. Now, in the second part of the paper, which I'm not going to go into detail on today, I ask, okay, we have these spillovers in reduced form. Do they actually matter? And to do this, I'm going to estimate a structural equilibrium model. Basically, we have people choosing, do they want to be entrepreneurs? Do they want to be workers? And that decision depends on their exposure to other entrepreneurs. I'm going to estimate that again using the census data, and I'll estimate that in the absence of spillovers, we would have about 10% lower entrepreneurship in the aggregate. So what that means is that these spillovers are important generators of new firms. They're not necessarily going to be important generators of incredibly productive firms. So very briefly, relative to the literature, I'm going to be studying kind of the multiple dimensions of spillovers in the very broad context. So we've got all these different spillover papers out there, but we don't have a really super broad context, and the kind of details and scope of the U.S. Census Bureau data will allow me to think about different types of spillovers. let's talk about data though. So the primary data set for this paper will be the LEHD. So this is the matched employer-employee data set for the US. So what that means is that I'm going to take 18 states that I have a balanced panel. For people in those 18 states, we can follow individuals as they move across firms, as they stay within the firm, how much they earn, things like that. We can see all those sorts of things. Now, this data is at something called the SCIN level, which is in some ways similar to an establishment, but it could be a combination of establishments. I'm happy to talk more about that later if that's of interest, but effectively, I'm just going to today, for simplicity, call it an establishment. What this means is that I know where people work, more or less, their establishment, and I know what firm they work at. So we have information on where people work. We know their earnings, we know their demographics, things like that. An important detail for this data is that it is going to be covering formally employed workers. We're not talking about self-employment here. So when I say entrepreneur, I'm not talking about an Uber driver. Instead, we're thinking about employment firms. And we have really the near universe of this population within these states. So in terms of kind of the key definition for this paper, I am going to follow the literature and define an individual as an entrepreneur if they are one of the top 3 annual earners at a new firm. So what we're going to take is we're going to take the LHD, we're going to identify firms when they first have employment, call that their first year, and we'll look at who are the top 3 earners in that year. So top 3 means that we're likely capturing kind of owners and or managers of these firms. So effectively people who are making a lot of money at these new firms relatively. And so these people may be making decisions or witnessing decisions that are really important to the development of new firms. That's going to be our definition of entrepreneur. One thing that's really great about the census is that we can combine this sort of data with other data sets kind of within the government's purview. So for instance, the CPS, ACS, and I'm trying to, at the moment, kind of validate this definition by looking at self-employment and business ownership data within those samples as well. The other important definition, of course, is a coworker. We're going to be able to look at coworkers at the same SCIN. So again, I'm just calling it an establishment, but at the same SCIN. Okay. So beyond the LEHD, I'm going to use 2 other main data sets for this paper today. This is, again, something that I really enjoy using the data for, is that the LEHD can nicely match to other data sets within the census, for instance, firm surveys. So I'll be using the annual survey of entrepreneurs, which was a survey that asked firm owners, for instance, why did you become an entrepreneur, as well as other details about why or how firms operate. This is quite helpful to kind of provide some color to our analysis. The other data set I'll be using today will be the LBD, for which I'm going to have national revenue, which I'll construct a measure of productivity, which will just be log revenue per worker. Okay, the basic exercise for this part of the paper is basically to take individuals in 2004. I'm going to take people in the middle of my data for my main analysis and ask, are they more likely to become entrepreneurs in the next 5 years between 2005 and 2009? So are they likely to be top earners at these new firms if more of their coworkers in the past, so more of the 2004 coworkers, were entrepreneurs in the previous 5 years? So you had a coworker, let's say again, you're working in manufacturing, you had a coworker who back in 1999, they were an entrepreneur of a construction firm. Now they are your coworker. What happens to your likely to becoming an entrepreneur? And then we'll say, okay, say you go on to start a firm. What type of firm do you start? What industry do you start? Does it grow? Does it survive? Is it productive? And so we'll be able to follow firm characteristics through to a number of years in the future. This is going to be, again, my sample of states. We've got about 47 million individuals in 2004 we're going to track the entrepreneurship of. So the main kind of empirical strategy we're going to do here is, well, let's just first start by saying, are you more likely to become an entrepreneur if you work with entrepreneurial coworkers? And we're just going to do some simple OLS regressions to kind of see if we see any patterns. I'm going to leverage variation in coworker characteristics, namely their entrepreneurship experiences in the past. So I'm going to run regressions of the following form. Are you, as an individual, more likely to become an entrepreneur in the next 5 years between 2005 and 2009 if a higher share of your 2004 establishment or SCIN coworkers were entrepreneurs in the past 5 years, 1999 to 2003? Now, of course, you're not randomly assigned to these coworkers, and we're still going to kind of, as a first pass, try to control for things that might be correlated with both your exposure to entrepreneurs and you're likely to becoming an entrepreneur. So for instance, how big your firm is that you're currently working at, whether you previously were an entrepreneur, how much you earn, your demographics, all those sorts of things. And so I'll show you the results of these regressions, and then I'll show you some identification tests. it's really important, I think, to ex ante say that we don't actually know what sign beta should take. Beta could be very well positive if your exposure to entrepreneurial coworkers means that you're learning something about entrepreneurship that actually inspires or teaches you in a way that makes you more likely to become an entrepreneur. On the other hand, again, you could have these coworkers, many of their businesses no longer exist. They could have had bad times. And so maybe they are discouraging entrepreneurship and beta is negative. So the sign is going to be informative here as well. I see there's a question, but I'm going to hold off to the end unless it's urgent. So this is going to be our main point estimates here. Let me just point your eyes to the last column. That coefficient says that that 0.025 says that if I take someone, let's take the same demographics, same industry they work in, all those sorts of things, and I take one person who has 0 entrepreneurial coworkers and another person who has entirely entrepreneurial coworkers, that second person is predicted to be 2.5 percentage points more likely to become an entrepreneur in the next 5 years. Now, maybe you say 2.5 percentage points, that sounds small. Only about 3% of people go on to become entrepreneurs, so that's an 80% increase relative to the mean. That's basically people being shoved towards entrepreneurship. Now, not really fair to look at 0 to 1. Very few people have entirely entrepreneurial coworkers, so I think it makes sense to kind of deflate our interpretation a little bit. I like to do standard deviations. You can pick your poison there, but if we take a standard deviation increase, that's about a 10 percentage point increase in the share of entrepreneurial coworkers. That predicts you're 8% more likely to become an entrepreneur relative to the mean. So people are kind of being meaningfully nudged towards entrepreneurship if we take these effects as causal. Now, identification is, of course, an issue here. People are not randomly assigned coworkers. People might be selecting into entrepreneurial settings and so forth. And so what I do in the paper is develop a series of tests that allow us to really kind of quantify the degree to which these sorts of concerns can contribute to our point estimate. And so if we basically want to be conservative, we can take that 8% increase relative to the mean, we can basically deflate it by a few percentage points to get a kind of post-selection corrected result. But let me briefly go through the tests that I do. You can see the details in the paper, but hopefully it's kind of capturing some intuitive ideas here. So I think the biggest identification concern here is that people who could be entrepreneurs might just happen to be at the same firms where people who used to be entrepreneurs end up. So for instance, lots of entrepreneurial people, some of them who were entrepreneurs in the past, some of them who are entrepreneurs in the future, maybe they all cluster at tech firms. And so the fact that we see lots of future and past entrepreneurs there together means that nothing about spillovers, it's just that they all happen to be there together. And so what we do in the paper is develop a series of tests. You know, the first one we can think is, okay, maybe this selection is happening at the firm level. People are clustering based on kind of firms. We can look and see, well, does it look like these spillovers are concentrated within a firm or within a SEIN, within an establishment? It's going to seem like they're clustered within an establishment. What I mean by that is that you're much more likely, and you know, the figure is demonstrating this, but you're much more likely to become an entrepreneur in the next 5 years if your coworkers at the same establishment as you, same SEIN as you, if they were previously entrepreneurs, much less so than if people who are at the same firm as you, but at a different location, different SEIN, if they were previous entrepreneurs. So if it was all about selection at the firm level, maybe it wouldn't really matter if I was actually measuring people you interact with. Instead, it's going to actually turn out to be that really the selection, or rather the spillovers seem like they're concentrated amongst people who are plausibly in the same location. Now, selection, I think, is maybe more arguably to happen at the establishment level. If you want to be an entrepreneur, maybe you go to the headquarters of a firm, not so much just a random establishment of theirs. And so the previous exercise doesn't help us. What I do in the paper is look at variation over time. So for instance, we can ask, let me just walk you through this figure here. I'm going to say, okay, let's take people who joined their establishment in 2004. Well, let me first just confirm, do we seem like we're seeing spillovers for that population? This is this blue estimate here, that's positive. It seems like joining the group that joins their establishment in 2004, if they work with more people who are formerly entrepreneurs in 2004, they are more likely to become entrepreneurs. The spillovers seem to be existing there. But now let me ask, does it look like they learned from people who were at the same establishment as them, but left in the last year, for instance? So this green dot here is, let's say, does it look like you're more likely to become an entrepreneur if there were lots of former entrepreneurs in the establishment the year before you got there, but those people have since left? Or the people who were there 2 years ago, but have since left, and so forth. And so these sorts of people, the green ones, they also chose to be at the headquarters. They're at the same establishment as you, but they don't overlap with you. You should not be learning from them. What we're going to see here is, again, this big gap. You're much more likely to become an entrepreneur if the people you actually coincide with were recently entrepreneurs than people who were there in the recent past. The green is not zero. We can basically think that there is going to be some selection here. And so we can actually just account for that in our interpretation of our final point estimates by deflating, for instance, our main estimate by a third. Now, we could also worry about selection into coworker groups, like I join a firm today because of the people who are there. I know them and I want to work with them or something like that. And what I can do is I can show that these spillovers seem to be there also when your coworkers who were entrepreneurs join after you get there. So it's not all going to be about people who I'm shopping for a job and I pick people who were, I pick a job based on where people are, who I expect my coworkers to be. We also seem like we're seeing spillovers from people who I didn't anticipate would be there when I joined the firm. So it's not all about me kind of selecting into these learning opportunities, for instance. Now, outside the firm, we can worry about other sorts of identification concerns, namely common shocks, like maybe there's regional or industry patterns going on. I'm already including a lot of fixed effects in my main specifications, but we can add variants of those sorts of empirical strategies or specifications rather, and things generally they go through very much. So it's not going to be the case that there's simply an industry where lots of entrepreneurship is happening. And so it looks like there's spillovers, but it's just that there's lots of entrepreneurship happening. Instead, these results are holding within industry by for instance, even zip code level. So even at that small cell level, it seems like these spillovers are there. Now, one other thing we can do to kind of bolster our interpretation of this as causal is to bring in some survey evidence. So namely, I'm going to bring in the annual survey of entrepreneurs, the ASC, which has this question of business owners of why did you start a firm? And one option they can give is that they had an entrepreneurial friend or family member who was a role model to them. It doesn't say an entrepreneurial coworker, but I always say hopefully some of your coworkers are your friends. And so what I can do is I can show that using the survey, the people who I think have entrepreneurial role models and go on to become entrepreneurs are more likely to say that they have entrepreneurial role models. So specifically, what I can see is that if you work with more entrepreneurial coworkers and then go on to start a firm, and that firm is surveyed in ASC, then you're more likely, or the owner is more likely to say that role models were important for their decision to become an entrepreneur. So in other words, the people who I think have entrepreneurial role models say they have entrepreneurial role models. So I think that's a nice kind of sanity check in a way. Now, to summarize the extensive margin, I'm arguing that these spillovers are there and they're plausibly causal. We can do lots of other things with this data to really kind of characterize these spillovers at the extensive margin. For instance, these spillovers are extremely commonplace. They're basically there in every sector. These spillovers seem to generate new entrepreneurs in the sense that people who previously were entrepreneurs themselves don't seem to react to having these entrepreneurial coworkers. I think that makes a lot of sense. If you just went through the experience yourself and you meet someone who also just went through the experience, there's nothing really you learn there. Instead, this seems to be really prompting new entrepreneurship. The spillovers at the extensive margin are going to be stronger when your coworkers are relatively successful as entrepreneurs. Maybe you're getting an extra, learning something extra. We'll get to that in a moment. And then these spillovers seem to be driven by what I think of as likely peers and role models. So we see these spillovers are basically strongest when your entrepreneurial coworker is a little bit older than you, maybe your kind of manager, for instance. They're really concentrated amongst people with similar earnings, so maybe people you actually interact with on a daily basis. And then they're also going to be similar or strongest amongst demographic groups. So for instance, these spillovers are very gendered. They basically happen within gender group. And then immigrants are going to be disproportionately learning from immigrant entrepreneurs, which I'm actually pursuing in future work. Now, we have this extensive margin, but let's turn the intensive margin. Namely, it looks like they learn entrepreneurship, but what are they learning? And are they learning to be more successful entrepreneurs, more productive kind of firms? And so really, again, this comes down to, does it look like these spillovers, this learning is prompting entrepreneurship without increasing profitability, basically lowering the entry cost? Or is it prompting entrepreneurship and actually leading to firms being more productive? Now, what I'm going to do is take the population of people from 2004 who go on to become entrepreneurs and ask, does the type of firm they start, their success, how relatively large they are, how productive they are, how long surviving and so forth, does that depend on their exposure to entrepreneurs back in 2004? What I'm going to find is that in general exposure to entrepreneurs who again, they tend to not be super successful themselves, because those coworkers, because they are now your coworker. General exposure seems to produce worse outcomes. These people who work with entrepreneurial coworkers in general and go on to start firms, they start what look like less successful firms. Again, I should say always that, they might be having a great time. We can't necessarily evaluate welfare, but they don't necessarily seem to be starting super productive firms. But conditional on general exposure, if you are, I'll say, lucky enough to work with relatively successful entrepreneurial coworkers, you're more likely to become an entrepreneur, and it seems like they have better outcomes. So there's maybe some scope for entrepreneurial skill transmission. I do want to briefly say something about identification here. We could be worried that, okay, we believe my extensive margin results. Maybe, the fact that you're not randomly assigned coworkers doesn't drive those results, but they could actually still drive these results. I can't tell you anything too dramatic on that right now because I am still working on the disclosure for that, but I want to kind of flag that it is important that we think about identification at every stage. Now with that, I'll just throw up a couple numbers just to kind of give you some flavor of how this all works. If you work with more entrepreneurial coworkers, you start a firm that's less likely to survive, it's smaller, you have lower labor market earnings. But if all of those coworkers were relatively successful in their entrepreneurial ventures, then things tend to reverse. You're starting a relatively larger firm, you're starting a relatively productive firm, and you have higher earnings relative to other firms that are starting at the same time that had fewer entrepreneurial coworkers. So what this all means is that these spillovers seem to transmit a mixture of things, and maybe unsurprisingly, what you get from your coworkers kind of depends on what they have to teach you. If your coworkers started firms that look pretty bad or pretty unsuccessful or unproductive, let's say, it doesn't look like you're learning anything super productive from them. But if you get those relatively successful ones, there does seem to be some entrepreneurial skill transmission. We can do, again, other things with the intensive margin, leveraging the kind of richness of this data. For instance, I can show that the spillovers seem to perhaps transmit some sector-specific knowledge. What I mean by that is that your sector choice is actually going to be predicted by where your coworkers were entrepreneurs. So for instance, again, I'm that manufacturing worker. I get a coworker who ran a construction firm in the past. When I go on to start my firm, I'm more likely to switch out of manufacturing and go start a construction firm. So maybe I'm learning something specific about that industry. Maybe I'm learning who to buy lumber from, all those sorts of things. But there seems to be some knowledge transmission there. The spillovers don't necessarily seem to be transmitting managerial skills. That's a result coming from the ASC. Nor do they seem to be transmitting any sort of financial investment or networks. Your coworkers are not giving you money. They're not connecting you with financing sources and so forth. Instead, having more entrepreneurial coworkers seems to predict more self-financed businesses. So it seems like people are starting kind of passion project firms that they're drawing from their own savings to start. And so we're not getting a ton of kind of high-end financing firms here. Briefly, these spillovers also seem to be a substitute for having entrepreneurial family. Within this literature, we know that entrepreneurs are disproportionately entrepreneurs in part because their parents were either entrepreneurs or they were wealthy. And that means that entrepreneurship is not evenly distributed across, for instance, races and ethnicities in the US. And so what I like to think about in this paper is that spillovers from coworkers are kind of an alternative route towards entrepreneurship. What I see is that if you work with more entrepreneurial coworkers, you're more likely to basically say that you're not starting a family-owned firm. You're starting more of an independent firm. You're not getting wealth from your family and so forth. And so this is, again, kind of a different route towards entrepreneurship. So to wrap up the paper, what I've found is that individuals do seem to learn entrepreneurship in this very broad context. But of course, what they learn depends on what their coworkers have to teach them. So it seems like it's this mixture of mechanisms. Some of your coworkers or most of your coworkers are going to be teaching you institutional knowledge that lowers your entry cost, but others are going to be teaching you entrepreneurial skills rather that makes you more likely to actually be productive. And the second part of the paper, which I don't have time to present today, we look at that model and I show that these spillovers do matter in determining aggregate patterns insofar as they do contribute to aggregate entrepreneurship in a meaningful way. So with that, let me say thank you so much for listening to the presentation. I have one more slide in just a second, but obviously we'll do Q&A in a moment. If anyone after the fact has more questions or wants to see the paper, paper's on my website and feel free to email me. Briefly though, I do want to kind of give a little RDC tips and tricks aside before we do questions. And I was trying to think about things that impartially, that I would have liked to know when I was starting my census journey. I've only been working on this paper for about 1.5 years, but I've been working with the data for 5 or 6 years at this point. And if you don't know, when you apply for census projects as an external researcher, it's a pretty lengthy process to apply and get the data. So it's kind of something that you want to think about before you do. And so if I had to boil it down, here's a couple of things. I think it's really important to really think about what special value census data can add to your project. So for me, it was really important for this paper to see a bunch of firms, see a bunch of people, and really see coworkers. So we need the LEHD for that. And I really like bringing in census surveys like the ASC that kind of give you some more detailed flavor about what firms are doing and so forth. One thing that wasn't obvious to me is that you can bring external data in. I highly recommend you talk to your admins about that if that's of interest. And so if you have external data that you think you could match in, that is, I believe, an option. Projects and project proposals and disclosures take a lot of time. So I always recommend including co-authors on projects, thinking about multiple papers when you're applying for a project and so forth. And the big thing for grad students, which I did write this paper as a grad student, is to try to join an existing project. So become an RA on a project. Ideally, you can maybe write a paper or something out of it. That is kind of the fastest way in many ways. Utilize the knowledge of your census admins. They know a lot, as well as your fellow RDC users. Everyone, I think, can help each other quite a bit here. And then finally, something I did not know before getting the data is that I highly recommend learning some basic SAS and SQL for working with larger data sets. It's much more efficient than I think kind of just working in Stata or something like that. So I highly recommend that. It's relatively simple once you get it going. But with that, let's talk about Q&A. Bryce, are you facilitating that, or should I just go through the questions?
Whatever you would like. If you want, I can go through it, or you can see the chat, correct?
Yeah, I can see the chat. So I
Okay.
believe this should be all the questions we had. I guess I can, yeah, I'll leave that up. So I believe the first question is from Nicole. I will just read it. There's a question of how do missing entrepreneurs affect interpretation? Great question. So this is saying that sole proprietors and owners of LLCs do not receive salaries, and so it won't show in the EHF, so the LEHD. Are you dropping these firms when defining entrepreneurs or identifying other employees at those firms as entrepreneurs? Really important question. So briefly, yes, the LEHD is going to be all labor earnings. And so sole prop owners and so forth don't receive salaries. That is an important population here. For my main estimates, I am including those firms. They are going to, for those firms, this is why I say we're interpreting people who are owners and or managers. So these are, when we have the top earner of sole proprietorship, that person's not the owner. Instead, they may be our manager. And so all the interpretation, I think, goes through if we think about managerial spillovers or something like that. There's still something special about kind of you going on to doing that at a new firm. It's not just about being a manager at a firm, and so that's distinct. I do have a exercise in the paper where I only restrict down to corporations and so forth, where we think the definition should actually maybe capture some owners and things go through there as well. But it's a fair point. It was something that I think I didn't quite do properly the first time around and kind of was stuck with it a little bit. But also this is frankly what people do in the literature, but it's absolutely not perfect. I see another question from JW. Does being employed in a different industry than the industry of the prior entrepreneurial coworker play a factor, as in my example? It affects your likelihood of where you go on to start a firm. As I said, kind of we see like some pulling towards the sector where your coworker was an entrepreneur. I have some other results on does it seem like where they were an entrepreneur affects your likelihood of becoming an entrepreneur in terms of relative to your current industry, but I don't believe I have the results out, so stay tuned on that. But good question. HHB, fully recognizing that the data will not be available for some time, would you consider running this very same methodology for the period surrounding March 2020? How did the Great Resignation impact this exact measurement? Yeah, so I currently have LEHD. Well, we have some interleave for this project, but currently have LEHD that I'm using through, I guess, 2013, 2014. So we are a while out. But yeah, I think it would be interesting. You know, I don't know, for instance, I'm not sure if this exact measurement, if you mean the measurement of the variables and things like that, but certainly whether or not my definition of entrepreneurship is correct, maybe that depends on the types of firms that were started during and so forth. But certainly, you know, we do know that the Great Resignation, there's a big flux of the labor market there. Christine Teo Trio, one of the census researchers, and I are actually currently working on a project on the Great Resignation. Maybe we'll sprinkle something in there about entrepreneurial spillovers and see if anything happens there. But would love to do it. Data takes time. There's another question. Could a prior successful entrepreneur coworker influence a coworker who had a failed entrepreneurship experience? Also a good question. What I have cleared out and so can tell you about is that having coworkers who, so if you yourself were an entrepreneur in the past, on average, that means that you were a failed entrepreneur, if we want to use that language. Having successful or unsuccessful entrepreneurial coworkers doesn't seem to influence your decision to become an entrepreneur. But what I would like to look at, and is on my to-do list, is to see if it looks like there is then differential selection into people who go on to become entrepreneurs. Serial entrepreneurship is absolutely a thing here. People go on and you know, try and try again. And so I think it could very well be that having successful entrepreneurial coworkers changes your outlook. Now, one thing I should you know, caveat, and that I didn't make a big deal about in the presentation, is that when we talk about successful entrepreneurs here, well, they still became your coworker. So we have an upper threshold of success here. Some of the firms, I should say, still exist and so forth that people, your coworkers started, but this is not, you know, do you get Steve Jobs as your coworker? This is, do you get someone who ran a business for 2 years as a coworker? But it is something I'm trying to look at. So thank you. From Jim Slutzer, a question about firm size and exposure to potential entrepreneurial colleagues. If I work at a 10-person firm, I likely know the other 9, but if I work at a 1,000-person firm, I probably only know a few. What can you say about firm size and the betas in your initial OLS regressions? Great question. I believe what I have cleared out is I do have some stuff split by firm size. The general finding is that indeed, kind of if you work with just any entrepreneurial coworker, if I run that regression, I believe that's an appendix table. If you have any entrepreneurial coworker, well, you're probably more likely to actually have a chance of running into them at a small firm. And so we expect the spillovers to, in some ways, have less measurement error there, the specifications. And that's what we see. You're going to be more likely to become an entrepreneur, conditional on having any entrepreneurial coworkers if you're at a smaller firm where you might actually run into them. It's not necessarily, I haven't done like tons of bins, so I don't know exactly how it all shakes out, but I think that intuition holds. And that intuition is also holding in, there's a related paper by Nanda and Sorensen from a while ago that also can do that. Their data allows them to do quite a bit on that, and they find similar intuition. Absolutely, the spillovers are going to be, you know, basically concentrated where you would think they would actually happen. Okay. Which data sets, from Todd Hines, which data sets did you use at the Census RDC? The main data sets for this paper are the LEHD, the LBD, and the ASE. So the matched employer-employee data, the firm kind of database, and one of the firm surveys. I have also used the MOPS survey, which is Management and Organizational Practices survey, also a great survey. There's other data sets that are complementary, I guess, that I've used, for instance, determining legal organization status. Are you a sole prop, for instance, like that? That's coming from the County Business Patterns Business Register, I think it's now called, data. And so I think the point being is that I mostly have worked with firm side data. There's also lots of demographic data. So for instance, also planning on looking at some stuff with the CPS and ACS and so forth. You can do more demographic side. Those are kind of the two different umbrellas of data as I think of it. Lots and lots of great data on there. Happy to, if you have a question about a particular one, happy to answer it here offline. last question that I'm seeing, but if there's more, feel free to add them, or if I accidentally skipped one, please let me know. What about having coworkers who are currently entrepreneurs, simultaneously employed and entrepreneurs? Do you see stronger spillovers? I don't think I've done exactly, well, okay, what I have done is I think I have some stuff cleared out on kind of whether the firm still exists, that they are, well, effectively we can, yeah, I have a version where it's like, does the coworkers firm still exist? In some ways that is a measure of success based on how I currently define it. And so I think there might be stronger spillovers. Frankly, I might have to go to the paper on this one. But I think that it's a good question of kind of, I mean, it's a kind of, we want to think about generally kind of selection into of who you can actually interact with, and you know, unsurprisingly, you know, there's always this important kind of thing to say in this paper is that this is not a paper documenting the capacity of any spillovers. This is not kind of like if you ran into Bill Gates at the grocery store, what do you learn? Instead, it's kind of about who you actually get to see. Most of these entrepreneurs, most of the former entrepreneurs, as in they started their firm in the past, their firm is they're no longer affiliated with the firm, and so either the firm no longer exists or they are no longer taking labor earnings there. And so I don't think that this particular context happens all the time, but I should look into it. Thank you. Okay. I think I hit all the questions. If there are others, feel free to put them in the chat or email me. Yeah, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melanie. We'll wait for just a second to see if there's anyone else that's typing currently. But thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This is very interesting research, and good luck taking it forward to the next steps.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll just go ahead and call it. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to Melanie. And I failed to announce at the beginning, if you have, so like I said, we're basically going to postpone the presentation series until later this calendar year, which means that if you have any research projects that are getting close to being done, and you have any interest, and the disclosure might be done early in 2023, feel free to reach out. We can definitely talk about penciling you in and making that happen. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Again, thank you, Melanie. This was fantastic. We'll see you next time. Everybody be healthy, stay well, and take care.
Great. Thank you.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for your participation. You may disconnect at this time.